Okay, so hi, this is Max. I'm from UN and Focus platform, and today we're speaking with Andrei Illarionov, famous Russian economist. So good afternoon, Mr. Illarionov.
Hello. Hello, Max. Hello, our listeners and viewers.
Mr. Illarionov, I have, my first question is, what is your view regarding Steinmeier formula, and what are risks for Ukraine? Isn't it taking place according to the Kremlin scenario?
I think it's a very bad formula. This is actually diplomatic formula for capitulation of Ukraine. This so-called formula has been formulated in the letter written by former ministers of foreign affairs of Germany and France, Steinmeier and Fabius, on November 28th, 2015, to their counterparts, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Lavrov, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Klimkin. And that formula has 6 points, which are dealing exclusively with the so-called local elections in the, this is special districts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. It does not touch at all issues of security, issues of withdrawal of foreign, meaning Russian troops from territory of Ukraine, withdrawal of any armaments, any military equipment from the territory of Ukraine into Russia. It does not touch it at all. It does not touch at all issues of establishing Ukrainian sovereign control of an internationally recognized border between Ukraine and Russia, which means that the whole situation, political, military, security situation, which exists at the moment right now in the east of Ukraine as a result of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, with separatist control over that part of the country, will stay as it is now under this formula. Moreover, it touches only the so-called local elections, meaning villages, towns, little districts, but it does not touch the so-called regional level, including the leadership of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic or Luhansk People's Republic. So that is why it does not touch even these elements of the management and power and so on. This formula gives participants of these elections right not to be arrested or pursued during this process of election. But after elections are finished and OSCE are making a statement that these elections have been organized according to the standards of OSCE, all people on this territory will be given amnesty, regardless of how many crimes, what kind of crimes, what kind of seriousness of crimes have been committed by those people. All of them are granted amnesty. And as a result of implementation of this formula, Ukraine, as a sovereign country, should recognize all organs, bodies, peoples who have been elected in this part of Ukraine as legitimate representative of the people on these occupied territories. Moreover, as we have been listening to the interpretation of this formula from Russia, from Kremlin, from people who are dealing with these particular issues, they're saying that as a result of the implementation of this formula, the so-called people's militia in numbers of tens of thousands armed men should be recognized as a legitimate law and order forces in this territory. And that is why those people should be recognized as legitimate law and order forces, not only in this part of the country, but essentially over all country, over all Ukraine, even in non-occupied territory of Ukraine. If we look into the depths of this idea, it means the same approach should be taken towards other bodies and elements of these quasi-power structures in the east of Ukraine, like prokuratura, like militia, like courts. So all of them should be recognized by Ukrainian authorities as legitimate. And all decisions taken by prokuratura or courts in the east of Ukraine should be recognized as legitimate by Ukrainian authorities. So essentially, it is legitimization of all the separatist enclaves as the powerful, as a legitimate representative of the part of in the part of the country. Moreover, as a result of this formula, because it will be as a result of this recognition, the whole point about aggression of Russia against Ukraine will be removed from the international agenda, because it will be essentially recognition by the Ukrainian authorities that the conflict, military conflict that claimed more than 13,000 lives in the east of Ukraine, essentially is not international conflict, but internal civil conflict within Ukraine. And that is why there is no especially interest and agenda for France or Germany or Britain or United States or international organizations in involvement in this conflict. And there is no any punishment to the Russian side. Everywhere it will be represented as the internal civil conflict in Ukraine. And that is why only Ukrainian authorities should deal with this and should take all responsibility for everything what's going on. So that is why it's rather hard not to call this formula and all consequences coming from this formula as full, unlimited capitulation of Ukraine.
So in this regard, so what's the ultimate plan of Russia regarding Ukraine, with this formula and so on? I mean, do you think that Russia wants to disintegrate Ukraine and then absorb some territory? How do you see this developing?
We should be accurate saying not so much plans of Russia, but plans of Putin. Because looks like not very many people can have any say and can have any influence on Putin's thinking about what to do with Ukraine. So, and when we're talking about Putin's plan, it is clear that it was evolving. Plans in year 2014 were slightly different from today because of the resistance that has been demonstrated by volunteer battalions and the military forces of Ukraine. And Putin was not able to fulfill the targets that he has announced in his speech of April 17th, year 2014. Then he proclaimed his purpose, establishing control over 8 regions of Ukraine, from Kharkov to Odessa. But the military resistance of Ukrainians did not allow Putin to establish his full control over this part of Ukraine. So now, when he was able to establish control only over parts of 2 regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, he tried to push both these so-called People's Republics back into the political and legal body of Ukrainian state, just to destabilize, to undermine Ukrainian states from within, not from outside as he tried in year 2014, but from within. And he not once said, and Lavrov and all other Kremlin spokespeople were saying not once, that implementation of Minsk agreement would lead to this new situation in which Donetsk and so-called People's Republics will control domestic and foreign policy of Ukraine, including the orientation of Ukraine towards Europe, European Union, NATO, or in any other direction. So it will be choice and it will be decision on which those so-called People's Republic would have a veto power, which essentially would block any independent development of Ukraine, whatever that development will be, whatever Ukrainians would decide to go, which particular direction. So that is why now, with current administration of Ukraine clearly giving up to Putin, unfortunately signing this Steinmeier formula, and making many other decisions like disarmament of 3 volunteers battalions in the east and many others, having seen that the current administration is rather weak, rather inexperienced, and rather sensitive to pressure and blackmail from Kremlin, Putin decided to raise his stakes. And from what we hear from Kremlin and from people close to Kremlin, Putin wants to establish full political and legal control over Ukraine, over Kiev authorities, to be able, either directly or through his proxies in Donetsk and Lugansk, or Medvedchuk, or Boyka and others, to establish such a control and to manipulate the whole political and legal life in Ukraine by himself. And moreover, they now so encouraged by this lack or absence of any coherent response from Ukrainian authorities that they have already proclaimed the time schedule for establishing such a control. They're already openly saying that they would like to finish all this business by the summer year 2020. So by next summer. So that is why they're thinking and they're hoping that they will be able to establish as full control over Ukraine by next summer.
So basically, to undermine Ukraine from within and keep it under control, keep it as a buffer zone, right? To prevent it from moving towards EU and NATO, yeah? So that's
it's a first step. It's a first step. But the second step, as Mr. Putin has described his long-term intentions in his speech on a Red Square in Moscow on May 9th, year 2019, when he was talking to his army, to his military men, servicemen on the Red Square, his long-term aim is reestablishment, restoration of the so-called historic Russia. This is a new term. It is not Russian world that was very popular a few years ago. This is a relatively new term, but relatively new term for general public, not for Mr. Putin himself. He is playing with this particular term already for several years, and he has given a detailed description of this term in year 2012, before the so-called election of him for a presidential term, in his article published in independent newspaper in Russia. According to him, according to Mr. Putin, historic Russia is a territory of Russian Empire at the end of 18th century. At the end of 18th century, it is after the third division of the Rzeczpospolita, but before acquiring the so-called Polish governance, the kind of Kingdom of Poland. Therefore, the so-called historic Russia in the West includes such territory like Belarus fully, most part of Ukraine, with exception of Galiciana, Transcarpathia, and northern Bukovina. And also it includes Transnistria, because the border of Russian Empire at the end of 18th century, around 800, went, according the famous rivers Zbruch. This is the division of Ukraine between the central and eastern part on one side and western Ukraine on the other side, and Dniester, so division of Transnistria and Moldova itself. Since he was very serious, and since he repeated several times his idea about restoration of historic Russia, it looks like that he's very serious about that. And that is why the current political situation in Ukraine, he considered it as a very convenient historic moment for restoration of the so-called historic Russia. So that is why it is not hard to imagine that after he would achieve what he is planning according to Steinmeier formula or Minsk agreement by summer year 2020, after that he will try to make next steps, establishing full control over at least substantial portion of Ukrainian territory and Belarus and Transnistria.
So basically, it's like some kind of rebranded geopolitical new Eurasianist project. Yeah, in the past, there were some steps aimed at implementing it, and right now you said that this is a new kind of rhetorics that he uses. Yeah, this is a new Russia, right?
To be correct, it is not Eurasian project, because Eurasian projects was looking and is looking eastward towards Kazakhstan, towards Kyrgyzstan, and that area. So from this point of view, this is absolutely new concept.
Okay.
And it is quite clear that the main ideologue of Eurasianism is Mr. Nazarbayev, former president of Kazakhstan and current leader of Kazakhstan, de facto leader of Kazakhstan. And Putin's approach is slightly different, because he is very knowledgeable about the serious problems of integration into the new political body of people who have been raised in Islamic traditions, which would be main problems for Eurasianism project. He is very serious about religion, about confession, and especially about the Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. He considers himself as a devout Christian, Orthodox Christian, and he looks like serious and sure that he would be able to integrate in one political body most Belarusians and most Ukrainians who have in their training, education, the so-called Orthodox elements of education, not Catholic elements. For example, Greco-Catholics from Galicia are considered not to be very suitable for integration into his project. But those people who lived in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, even they are not religious people, but they have been raised in this tradition. They are accustomed to this tradition. Those very good and suitable people who could be easily integrated into this new political body. His formula for creation of new Russian state and new Russian nation that he has made 2 years ago in Yaroslavl is very clear. He said that time, and he repeated partially several times later, that the formula of new nation, Russian nation, as we know that he does not recognize Belarusians and Ukrainians as independent nations. He considers them as a separate, he considers himself as a part of the same nation, Russian nation. So he produced a formula for Russian nation as such: common market, common language, common religion, and common prince. So that is why he was so much pressing against signing and accepting association agreement of Ukraine and European Union back in year 2013, because he was trying to preserve the so-called common market between Russia and Ukraine. Common language is Russian language, and we understand that all Belarusians and essentially all Ukrainians do understand and do speak Russian. Common religion, which means Orthodox religion, with exception of a small portion of Belarusians who are Catholics, and some portions of Ukrainians in Galicia who are Greco-Catholics. And the final point is common prince. And nobody has any doubts what is the last name of this common prince.
Yeah. So what's next for Ukraine? How can Ukraine preserve its sovereignty? What would you recommend Mr. Zelensky to do to stop this?
Not only me, but many other people have recommended to Mr. Zelensky these sets of recommendations, but it looks like that Mr. Zelensky is not interested in those advices, because all those advices have been proclaimed so many times, so loudly, in so many places, in his presence, that it is absolutely impossible not to hear them. And the very fact that he never accepted those advices, never repeated those advices, and persistently taking very different and very opposite advices, it's clear that he is not interested in those advices. But for general public, certainly we should repeat those advices and those recommendations. First of all, no to Formula Steinmeier, no to Minsk agreements, both first and second, because they are very dangerous and risky and destabilizing independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. And I seriously doubt that Normandy format is a good format for any negotiations of Ukrainian leaders, any Ukrainian presidents with Putin. If we look into a little bit longer term perspective, it is quite clear that Ukraine today, based on its economic, political, diplomatic, financial, military situation today, Ukraine cannot establish and re-establish its control over eastern Donbass, Crimea, Sevastopol, and Kerch Strait today, even tomorrow. So that is why Ukraine needs to establish clear line with occupied territories of Ukraine, which are legally belongs to Ukraine, and nobody is going to, in the whole world, deny Ukraine from its legitimate right to establish control sooner or later over these occupied territories. But for the moment, Ukraine should concentrate on building new society, new economy, new state, much more efficient, much more dynamic, much stronger, to re-establish, to restore control over occupied territories. Ukraine can, but not today, not tomorrow, maybe in some time in future. When? It is not possible to say today. France needed 48 years to restore control over Alsace and Lorraine after Prussia occupied and annexed these two provinces in 1871. Next time, France were waiting for 6 years to re-establish control over Alsace and Lorraine. Western Germany was waiting more than 40 years until it was able to restore control of Eastern Germany and to reunite country. Japan is waiting for 74 years to restore control over Kuril Islands. we see that even such big, strong, powerful, respected countries like France, Germany, Japan are waiting for decades to restore their control that they consider legitimate over the occupied territories that they consider territories that illegitimately occupied by someone. Since Ukraine today is in much weaker position compared to France, Germany, and Japan in any period of history that we're talking about, so that is why Ukraine needs to accumulate resources, forces, strength to be able to restore this control. And before that, Ukraine should devote all possible resources for own development and to come back to this issue when will be suitable moment.
But realistically speaking, what do you think will take place in Ukraine? What's going to happen? I mean, with Zelensky, you mentioned that he was hesitant, to listen to advice of experts. Yeah, those things that you mentioned. So, how do you see the situation actually developing, realistically speaking? I mean,
we don't know for sure what he's going to do in the remaining 4.5 years of his presidency. So far, it looks like that he's not interested in what he has promised in his campaign, because his presidential campaign was not about to stop the war. His main slogans in campaign was to stop corruption, to make efficient economy, to make dynamic economy, to raise living standards of Ukrainians. That was his main slogans. But to make these promises happen, he needs to concentrate on Ukrainian agenda, but not on agenda of helping Mr. Putin to establish control over Ukraine. This is a very different agenda. This is a very different target, and there is a very different aims. So that is why we clearly see the shifting in the policy orientation for Mr. Zelensky. For me, it's for the moment it's rather hard to explain why he has shifted so much, why he has decided to do it. And because it's still beginning of his presidency, he has a chance to come back to his promises, to his original promises, since he has some time. But if he will insist on this new agenda, that will be a different story. And that is why if he will be, let's say, if he will be able to succeed in this area, so we would probably not be able to talk about independent Ukraine or any other targets and any aims for independent Ukraine. So that will be a different world.
And you mentioned, sorry, I will touch upon this briefly. You also mentioned that Ukraine is to build itself from within, yeah? Its economic strength and its development. It should focus on its development, yeah? And do you think in the last 5 years Ukraine has actually achieved something? I mean, did it build up its strength in combating Russian, let's so-called hybrid warfare? Do you think it has had some progress in this?
You mean in the last 5 years?
Yeah, in the last 5 years, and do you see it's going in a positive direction? It looks like it's not going in a positive direction, is it?
So I think there is some achievements on Ukrainian side, but frankly speaking, I consider them very modest. And I'm absolutely sure that much more could be and should be achieved within these 5 years. We can compare the results of aggression against two independent post-Soviet countries, Ukraine and Georgia. Ukraine in year 2014 at the kind of the beginning of the aggression, and Georgia year 2008 as another very visible aggression of Russian troops, actually open aggression of Russia against Georgia. 5 years after year 2008, Georgia grew 40%. And at some point, the growth was close to 8% per year. Ukraine, 5 years since year 2014, declined substantially. And even today, I'm not sure that it was able to recover to the level pre-year 2014, or maybe around this level. If we look into the amount of reforms, economic, political, legal, that have been implemented in Georgia within 5 years since Russian aggression, it's just incomparable with Ukraine, or Ukraine is incomparable to Georgia. It's necessary just to look into what kind of Tbilisi became as a result of those reforms, or Batumi, with new constructions, with new institutions, with new Ministry of Interior, with new police, and so on. And what we can have in Ukraine, it's just incomparable. And what is also important, in year 2008, Ukraine was much richer in terms of GDP per capita than Georgia. Today's situation is different. Today, Georgia has higher GDP per capita than Ukraine. So that is why, yes, we can mention some steps that have been done by Ukrainian authorities over the last 5 years. And some steps can be considered as positive, but there were a lot of steps made in a very negative directions, like destruction of economy that has been done by head of National Bank of Ukraine, Gontareva, and the very anti-economic policies that have been pursued by the Ministry of Finance under Madame Yeresko, which actually kept Ukrainian economy from growth. And that policy cannot be attributed to Mr. Putin. Yes, Putin is responsible for annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol and Kerch Strait. Putin is responsible for occupation of Eastern Donbass and for waging war against Ukraine. But it was not Putin who is responsible for this prolonged contraction and stagnation of Ukrainian economy. That is the responsibility of the Ukrainian authorities. And Ukrainian economy still does not grow as it should grow. The best economic growth in Ukraine during these 5 years was 3-4% per year, and after that it declined to 2 or even 1%. Once again, Georgian economy in much more difficult situation because Georgia does not have such a geopolitical density as Ukraine. Much more territory of Georgia has been occupied by Russian troops, and the whole territory of Georgia has been cut in two when Russian troops occupied Gori and cut all connection between Eastern Georgia and Western Georgia with Black Sea ports. Nevertheless, Georgia was growing pretty fast, very dynamic, because Georgian authorities were able to create liberal, free economy that produced remarkable economic growth. Ukrainian authorities did nothing compared to what has been done by Georgians. So that is why my overall conclusion that I'm pretty modest in assessment of results of Ukrainian authorities over the last 5 years.
But do you see hope? Is there hope? Do you think we can be optimistic for the future?
Unfortunately, no, because I've listened to leaders of Ukraine last month in Kyiv during YES conference. President, prime minister, ministers, deputy prime ministers, and frankly speaking, the impression is very depressing.
But you know, in the West, I see a lot of people write that it's a young, dynamic, Western-educated team, And there's so much hope in the West and in Ukraine about some possible progress, and some reforms. But it seems that the situation is rather bleak, right?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
This is my assessment. I haven't seen and I haven't heard any person who, from my point of view, understand the challenges in front of Ukraine, the long-term purposes, instruments of policies that should be used, and approaches. Just I have not seen anyone who understands the job in front of them.
So basically, there is no vision, there is no policy plan, right, to transform Ukraine.
Certainly, it does not necessarily mean that it will happen like this, but how we judge people and how we judge politicians. We judge either by their words or by their deeds, right? So it was not much time for deeds yet, because the cabinet, the government has been formed less than 2 months ago. And so far we have not seen many deeds yet, except of, not many deeds. But as for words, I have not heard any words that I would interpret that they do understand the job. When I listened to Georgians back in year 2008 or year 2004 or later, it was absolutely clear understanding what they would like to achieve, how they would like to achieve, what kind of obstacles they have, and how to overcome those obstacles. It was very clear view from not one person, from dozens of persons who occupied the key positions in the Georgian government and the Georgian presidential administration and the Georgian parliament. I have not met a single person in Ukraine who would have even a portion of this understanding and knowledge that I've seen in Georgia. So that is why I even just don't have any basis to judge. Just today, somebody sent me a piece from the current Minister of Economy, who proudly claims that he does not read books because it's not good.
Oh my God, okay.
It's not a joke. He claimed it, and it has been republished in many places, and he said that is wrong. I'm a researcher. I'm writing books. That is why I don't need to read books, and to read books does not produce any good. So I just, once again, maybe there will be some miracle, and tomorrow all those people would start to produce miracles, and we will be applauding them for successes that they will achieve. But at the moment, I just don't see any basis for that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I actually ran out of questions and I don't want to take more of your time. I wanted to thank you, for your time and for answering my questions. I really appreciate it. And I think that viewers will also appreciate this interesting discussion.
Okay.